This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Clarissa Myrick-Harris White, who teaches in the Department of Africana Studies at Morehouse College. She is the author and editor of a number of scholarly and public-facing pieces, co-edits the journal The Black Scholar, and is co-founder of the Black Men's Research Institute at Morehouse. In this conversation, we discuss community and activism in the founding of the field, cultural and political work as Black studies work, and the place of Black studies in historically Black colleges and universities. Good morning, Clarissa. How are you today?
Good morning, John. I'm well. How are you?
I am fantastic. We were talking before. I'm about to turn in my grades. Well, hypothetically about to turn in my grades and close out this semester. And this is a really nice way of transitioning into break to have you as a guest on the podcast. I'm really excited to have you as part of the series. I think the kind of work that you do, your work with Black Scholar, your work at Morehouse, and some of these other things that we've been talking about, I'm really interested to hear about. Your perspective is immensely important to get on this series. And I just wanted to welcome you to the podcast and also thank you in advance for your time and thoughtfulness.
Well, thank you, John. Thank you for the invitation. I'm excited to have this conversation with you.
Well, we'll have a chance to talk, of course, about your work, the kind of research and organizational work that you do, and how it relates to the field of Black studies, both in its past and future iterations. But I wanted to start with maybe a more personal question, which is to ask you, what drew you to Black studies? What drew you to the study of Black life? And always for me, this really important part, like what sustains you and keeps you committed to this kind of work?
That's a great question. So I will answer it in sort of two parts. Just first, in terms of my educational background, I earned a BA in English and a minor in journalism. Morris Brown College, a historically Black college here in Atlanta, Georgia. The minor courses I took at what was then Clark College, which is right across the way, a part of the Atlanta University Center. And Morris Brown, by the way, is the only HBCU and, by extension, the only higher education institution in Georgia established from the very beginning by African Americans in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. My master's degree is in journalism from The Ohio State University. And my PhDs from Emory University, Graduate Institute of Liberal Arts, and American Studies is the program I went into for the PhD. But ultimately, my program was truly in African American Studies. Most of my content courses were in or related to African American Studies decades before Emory officially established a PhD program in African American Studies just recently in 2022. In fact, the Emory doctoral program is the first in the South in African American Studies or Black
The first
studies.
in the South.
Yeah.
I had
Isn't
not
that
put two and
something?
two together on that.
Yeah,
Wow.
something according to this, okay? And that should be, but I think that needs to be modified because within the Atlanta University Center, there has been a doctoral program, programs really, in the vein of African American Studies for quite some time. So I think they're speaking primarily to PWIs, predominantly white institutions. That's something that needs to be checked. But in fact, when I entered my PhD program, and I must say that I first went into a doctoral program at Howard University in English. And I was not satisfied. Well, and I shouldn't say not satisfied with the quality. It was a great program, but it was a little too narrow for me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So, as I said, when I entered my PhD program in Atlanta, first at Howard in Atlanta, there were no Black Studies doctoral programs anywhere in the country.
Mm.
It's been that long ago, John. But I was fortunate once I joined Emory, the ILA, the Institute for Graduate, the Graduate Institute for Liberal Arts. I was fortunate to be under the tutelage of some of the great foundation builders, some of the great scholars of early Black studies. For instance, my dissertation advisor was Dr. Richard Long, and he was a cultural historian who really, really he's underappreciated, but his contributions started really before the 60s.
Mm.
And he trained, prepared, mentored a number of scholars in the field. And another undervalued scholar in the field, Dr. Carolyn Fowler. She was author of the groundbreaking book, Black Arts and Black Aesthetics.
Mhm.
So she, and one of the things we had an opportunity to do when I was at Emory was we could take courses, graduate courses, at Atlanta University. What was in Atlanta University was that long ago. That was before the merging of Clark College and Atlanta University. And I was also advised by the legendary Jerry Ward, Dr. Jerry Ward, and he was an advisor on my dissertation on the Free Southern Theater of which started at Tougaloo College in Mississippi and was developed at in New Orleans over the course of decades, over really the lifespan of the civil rights movement, Black Power movement of the 60s and 70s in particular, but it lived on into the 80s, that particular theater. Okay, but to understand my intellectual journey to and in the field of Black studies, you really have to understand my beginnings, John.
Mm. Mhm.
My grandfather, the Reverend William Myrick, was an AME minister, a minister of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. My parents actually met on the footbridge of Morris Brown College in the late 1940s. My
Oh,
fa
so your Morris Brown roots go real deep
Yes,
that
deep,
your
go
parents met there.
way, way
Okay.
deep, and I even had a great uncle who, he was in the class of, I think, 1925 at Morris Brown College. And again, Morris Brown College is an AME institution established by that church.
Mm.
Okay, my father had been an Army private during World War II. And he started college, prior to the war, and then he was drafted. And he ultimately came back to Morris Brown and finished under the GI Bill. Okay, so in World War II, he served in the European theater. He spent time in France, England, and because he had a year under his belt in college, he could type. He was assigned to communications, and he also drove some of the commanding officers around in a Jeep. I have this wonderful photo of him standing, in front of the Jeep that he drove, and he's looking so young, and that's one of my cherished family photos.
Mhm.
But he was always very tight-lipped about his years in service until one day I invited him to speak to a class, an African American Studies class I was teaching. And he opened up about his experiences in Europe, and he revealed to me for the first time something I never heard him talk about before, that he was among the troops that stormed the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944. And that's a little-known history, the fact that there were about 2,000 Black troops who were a part of the military invasion by the Allies on the beaches of Normandy. You don't hear about and they were often in some of the most dangerous positions. He talked about, during that class, having step over bodies as they were coming up the beach. Now again, he was not in a fighting unit, although there was an African American fighting unit that stormed the beaches of Normandy. He was with communications, but he talked about walking over bullets and hearing bullets whiz by his head. He also recounted, prior to that, the experience of losing colleagues who were part of the Red Ball Express. The Red Ball Express was this unit of supply trucks, often driven, I think primarily, in fact, driven by African Americans, African American men primarily, in Europe during this period of time that he was stationed there, had the camps there. But there were still, enemy soldiers, Germans around, and before leaving an area, they would plant landmines. And so he recalled talking to a friend, and a friend stopped and said hello to him as he was driving by his truck, and he drove off, and my father heard this explosion, and the truck was blown up. It had run over a landmine, so the young man he had just talked with was blown to bits. When my father recounted that story, that was the first time I ever remember seeing my father cry. Okay, at that point, it was a memory that, this was in the mid-'90s, so it was a memory that was 50 years old. And he later he said, "If you don't ever ask me to come and speak to your class again." But
Jeez. Yeah.
aside from that and another oral history interview I did with him and my mom, those are the only opportunities I had to hear those stories from the perspective of someone by that time who had become a scholar in Black studies. And so the kinds of questions I could ask were questions I could not have asked, would not have known to ask earlier. So I treasure those memories and those interviews. My father passed in 2012. But he joked with me that he thinks that a main reason he never made it past private first class, even though he was awarded, a couple of medals, Good Conduct Medal and the medal because he served in the European theater, but he was never promoted. And he said he believed that the reason for that was his commanding officer once called him into his office and told him essentially, he wanted him to be a spy. He wanted him to spy, not on the Germans,
Mm.
but he wanted him to spy on his fellow Black servicemen and then report back to him what they were thinking and feeling. And of course, my father said, "Yes, sir," and left the office. But he told us he was very, very proud of the fact that each time he was called in to tell what he had learned, he said, "I have nothing to report, sir." And he said his commanding officer just became so frustrated and just
Yeah.
furious, really. But, what can he say?
Yeah.
And just continuing for a moment with this vein, because all of this comes into play in terms of my intellectual development, my personal experiences, personal family history, so influenced the trajectory of my life as an educator and scholar and community activist. Both my parents were in Atlanta as a result of their families being a part of the Great Migration. Of Black folks from the rural South to urban areas. But many folks, and perhaps most folks, don't really realize or acknowledge the fact that the Great Migration was not only from the South to the North, but Black folk went from the rural South to the urban South. That was a part of the migration,
Yep.
as opposed to continuing north. They stopped in places like Atlanta. Atlanta was a big draw for African Americans, but also other southern cities all along the way. Some stopped even before Atlanta and down in Savannah. Others went, and ended up in Nashville, and others went a little farther north and ended up in cities in Kentucky and so on. But that migration was from the rural South to urban areas that were north of wherever they were coming from.
Hmm.
And so there are stories in that I really, that your time, I don't think you have the time for you to tell all of those stories that came into play in terms of my family history. But one I'll mention is the Moores Ford lynching. Have you heard of that, John?
No, no.
Okay. Well, it occurred in 1946 in Monroe, Georgia. And it refers to the July 1946 murders of 4 young Black people, 2 couples, married couples. They were killed, butchered by a group of white men in Monroe, Georgia. Now, this has a personal connection for me because my mother's family, my family on my mother's side, moved from Monroe, Georgia to Atlanta, Georgia in the late 1930s, okay? 1930s, it was before 1940, yeah, in the late 1930s. My great-grandmother was very wise in doing that because she had sons, she had 4 sons, okay? And she knew that that was not the best place to be with 4 sons who were teenagers, emerging young men. So she was concerned about their safety, and then she had about 4 daughters, and she was concerned about their safety as well. So she was a single matriarch. And so she picked up, and the whole family moved to Atlanta, extended household, 1 house. And then fast forward to 1946, and the news of the lynching of the 2 Black couples in Monroe, Georgia hit the news. It not only made the local news, it made national and even international news. Truman sent investigators
Hmm.
to Monroe to find out all they could find. But of course, there's no outcome in terms of they never arrested anyone to this day, or got any information about who murdered those young people. And even the motivation is murky. But one of the women who was murdered, May Murray Dorsey, had been the best friend of my great aunt Belle. And so, growing up, I always wondered why Aunt Belle she was an interesting personality. She would, just wonderful in terms of full of stories and loving, but, you say the wrong thing, and she would go off in terms of her temper. And so fast forward years later after her death, and after I learned that, Mae Murray, her best friend on the planet, um, was one of the women, 2 women killed, I came to understand that, she was suffering from trauma, okay?
Yeah.
Having her best friend to not just die, but die in that way. And this gets gory, John, but I think it's important to know, and this is called the Morris Ford Bridge lynchings was called the last mass lynching in America at that point. And of course, I don't think it was, but because we knew about it, it had that. If you look it up, that's what you'll see, the last mass lynching in America, and it garnered attention across the country. But again, nothing ever, and to this day, they've not been able to determine who the murderers were. But the other woman, Dorsey Malcolm, okay? There was a brother and a sister among the couples, and, brother and sister each married individuals, but Dorsey was pregnant at the time. Dorsey Malcolm, she was pregnant at the time. The lynchers, the murderers, riddled their bodies with bullets, okay, and mutilated their bodies, and then cut the baby out of the stomach of Dorsey Malcolm and killed the baby. That's the kind of thing that's difficult to hear, but again, it's the kind of thing that's important to hear and understand, to understand the brutality of the terrorism that African Americans endured in the South, but not only in the South, John. We know that these kinds of things, these kinds of atrocities occurred throughout the country. If you look at a map, there were lynchings or massacres, the destruction of Black cities, towns, neighborhoods, businesses. Those occurred throughout the country. And again, these are stories that I'd heard bits and pieces of as a child, but learned about them in greater detail and understood how my personal family history was connected to these larger stories of the experiences of African Americans. That discovery occurred once I started my higher education, first in college, then in my graduate program at Ohio State, and then a program at Howard, and then ultimately at Emory as I began to do my research. I'm going to double back for just a second. I earned my master's, as I said, at the Ohio State University in journalism, and my first real job was as a researcher writer, and this is going to date me, as a researcher and writer for Time Life Books. The Time Life Books division was in the D.C. area in Alexandria, Virginia at the time. So I was hired as a researcher writer, and I did research and wrote captions and also introductory sections of books that were in the World War II series and the Wild Wild West series and a series called The Healthy Heart, okay? And so it was while in that position, and yeah, I'm dating myself, but we're talking about late 1970s, okay? Late 1970s, very early 80s, 80, 81, from 78 to 81. It was while I was there that I decided I was going to go back to graduate school and earn a PhD that focused on Black folks, okay? Because it was such a battle to really advocate for the inclusion of the roles, the contributions of African Americans in World War II, the Wild West, certainly. First cowboys were African American, okay? And then even the series on The Healthy Heart. And I remember we had what was called showings, in which we pitched to the top editors topics for books in a series, or even essays that were within the series. So this particular book focused on open heart surgery, the first surgeries, and so there was this gentleman, okay, Vivian. Why is his name escaping me now? Vivian Thomas. Yeah. So this is a man who was at Johns Hopkins University. He worked as a lab technician at Johns Hopkins. He was in the lab of a cardiologist, okay? Okay, his ambition, this young African-American man at the time, his ambition was to become a doctor, okay? But he was never able to get the resources, and for various reasons, including racism, he never realized his dream. But he did become a lab technician and then a lab supervisor at Johns Hopkins in the 1940s. And he actually was the person who developed the procedure, okay, to correct the blue baby syndrome. Okay, have you heard of that? Blue baby syndrome? They call the procedure, now they call it the Blaylock-Thomas-Taussig shunt. He created this shunt. But he was actually the person to do it. Okay, Blaylock was the white cardiologist that he worked under, in the laboratory. Okay, but he developed the procedure that Blaylock initially took credit for. Okay, that history has come out, and so he's been honored. There's a portrait of him actually hanging at Johns Hopkins, and there was a movie about it in the early 2000s, I think it was, and the actor Mos Def the actor Mos Def, played him in that movie.
Huh.
And the movie was called Something the Lord Made. Okay, if anyone interested in checking out the movie. So um, I'll pause there for a moment just to talk. I'm just wanting to talk about some things in my life that led me
Yeah.
to the Black studies. So after that experience, having to really pitch and push for a section of the book on the healthy heart to include an essay about Vivian Thomas, and they ultimately did. But it was a lot of work.
Yeah.
Okay, I said, okay, well, I want to become the expert. Okay, I want to be the ones to tell folks you need to write about this. I want to be the one to write about these things myself.
Mhm.
Okay, and so that's when I made my decision to go on into a doctoral program. But at that time, John, there were no PhD programs in African American
Yeah.
studies. We're talking the early 80s at this time. And so I started at Howard. And again, it was too narrow a focus. And so I read about the program at Emory. I said, that's home. So I'm going to go home. and
Yes.
and did. And oh my goodness, what an experience. And actually, okay, Emory, no, it's okay, a good program. American Studies was what I came in under, because of its interdisciplinarity, right? But I was most attracted because of the control, okay, that they allow doctoral students to have in shaping your program.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so, and if you look at my transcript now, it was African American Studies, Africana Studies, really what we call it today, because I took courses from the African Studies department. There was an African Studies department, right? But of course, most of those at that point in the African Studies department, most of the faculty were white faculty, Europeans doing African
Sure.
studies. But so I took courses, and I had some good professors there. Dr. Eddie Bay was great. Um, and I was also able to take courses, as I said, at Atlanta University. Okay, that's where I studied under Dr. Carolyn Fowler. And by this time, Dr. Richard Long was on the faculty of Emory
Mhm.
University. And so he became my dissertation advisor. It was also during this time that really perhaps the most impactful of my experiences occurred. I was able to participate in a workshop, a community workshop that was taught by and in the home of Toni Cade Bambara.
Hmm.
Okay, she lived actually
Wow.
10 minutes from the campus, 10 minutes from my home. She opened her house to anyone who wanted to come and talk about share writing. So what a wonderful experience.
Amazing.
And I jumped ahead before one of the affirmations of my decision to come back to Atlanta and enroll in the program at Emory was the experience I had while still in the D.C. area while there and while I was a graduate student at Howard. I was just there a year. But during that time, I left my job at Time Life, and I worked part-time at the Smithsonian Office of Public Affairs. And it was during that time, working in the Office of Public Affairs, I was charged to write about various exhibits. And I always asked to write about the exhibits about Black folk. So I wrote for the news service, the Smithsonian News Service, and for the in-house publication called The Torch. That's the Smithsonian. And so I wrote about the exhibition that was done on the Negro Baseball League. I wrote an article about the book that was edited by Robert Snowden, a Black anthropologist, art historian at Howard, but a book that he wrote in collaboration with Smithsonian called The Image of the Black in Western Art.
Mhm.
I was able to go do an article about the African African Art Museum that really became the precursor foundation for the African Art Museum that exists on the mall now. It started out in a little brownstone in a community in Washington, D.C., and so I was able to write about
Hmm.
that. And also during that time, and really, I'm gonna backtrack just a bit, something that confirmed my decision to go back to work on my doctorate and focus on the African American experience was a workshop that I participated in. This must have been like in 1979, because I had left Time Life in 80. In the winter of 79, I decided, yeah, and this was even before I got a car, okay, because I was on the bus and on the train to a workshop at GW University that was being taught by Amiri Baraka, okay? And I'd read about it, and I said, "I gotta go." And so it was dead of winter, it was snow, ice, after there was an evening workshop, so after work, I'd get on the bus in Alexandria, go to the train station, get on the metro, go to get and then trudge
Yeah.
to get to that class, and what an experience that was, experiencing him in the flesh, and so different from the fiery image that you see of him, and then you see the recordings of him reading his poetry. You see images of him, the firebrand, but in that workshop, he was so low key, you know? And so warm and generous, and the class was primarily white students, right? Because it was GW,
Interesting.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I was one of a few, just 2 or 3 Black students who were even in the class, and so there were students. So it was a workshop that was open to students of GW and individuals in the community, okay? So Baraka always lived up to that ideal for Black studies, okay, the Black arts, the goal of the Black Power, Black arts movement to make the study of the people of African descent experiences, to open it up so that you're educating those in the community, okay, as well as those in the academy. And so these experiences, John, are the kinds of things that shaped my identity, and I would be remiss if I did not also bring up my encounter with, while a student at Emory. And I don't even remember the first encounter. I must have gone to some type of poetry reading, or maybe Tony introduced me to him. But at the time, the Black arts poet, Askia Mohammed Touré, was living in Atlanta.
Hmm.
And I met him and really established this wonderful relationship with him. He became sort of a mentor to me. And we actually ended up, me and a couple of other colleagues, or not colleagues at that time, they were fellow writers, poets, and fiction writers, essayists. We created journal this little journal called The Southern Star. Look how
Amazing.
thin, it's so thin, look how thin it is, but, and I got a grant from the Bureau of Cultural Affairs for $500, right?
Huh.
And we produced this little
Love.
journal. And I did an interview with Sonia Sanchez, that's in this. Askia poetry is here. A woman named Malaika Adero, who went on to become an editor at was it Random House? She has a short story in here. So it was my first foray into this kind of publishing after leaving Time Life. So for me, a major objective was not to be an academic at that point in time. When I went back to school, my focus was on publishing.
Yeah.
Whether academic publishing, journalistic publishing, but books, getting information out, and not just to an academic audience, but to the world. Not either or, but both and. I wanted to write and produce, publish, edit work that would be embraced and read and absorbed by folk, not in the academic world for sure, but most importantly, information, books that would be accessible to people in the community, across sectors. And so I'm going to pause there.
This is fantastic. Thank you for all of that. I mean, in some ways, the second question I have for you, I think you've sketched out a very deep and interesting response. Because one of the things that I keep hearing in this retelling is, you were, um, these stories that you were advocating to be told, being an English major, but also studying journalism. It's all this sort of draw to and compulsion to tell and find and make present all of these stories in various kinds of ways, whether it's a story of poetic expression, or the story of a cardiologist assistant who changed this kind of treatment, and that it was Black studies that sort of brought that together for you.
Yeah.
So, maybe that's then a sort of pathway into this question about, how do you see the field of Black studies?
Mm.
Like, what's that portrait for you? And
Mm.
I think about its origin point, which I think draws so much of what you've been talking about together, which is, the imperative of Black studies was it had a tension built into it, right? It had the activism of students who wanted to place a study of the Black intellectual tradition, Black art, Black history, sociology, etc., that the disciplines traditionally had not been able to account for, and that Black
Mm-hmm.
studies was going to be where intellectual life about the souls of Black folk could be studied.
Yes, in a
But
holistic way. Yes,
in
yes.
a holistic way. And then, but that's also comes at the moment where the Black liberation struggle radicalizes in ways that really complicate, if not outright erase, those boundaries between something like a classroom and a community, between
Yes.
books and prescriptive political action, between ideas and political intervention.
Yes.
And so there's also that political imperative of Black studies that's like, there's the intellectual tradition and a commitment to that, but also commitment to a certain kind of politics of liberation. And I think there's a tension built into that in terms of what Black studies is that still is with us when we talk about the field 50-something years later. And sort of in that frame, I wanted to ask you, what's that portrait that you work with?
Mm. And, I think there's a kind of and I hear what you're saying in terms of that tension, but in my mind, it's kind of a false dichotomy. It's kind of a yeah,
Mm.
it everything everything that, we do, in life, as people of African descent in particular, is political, okay? And so you can't separate one from the other. And in times like the times we live in now, it becomes even more so when just teaching, of course, in some places, in some higher education institutions in this country, to teach the courses that I teach in the way that I teach could be grounds for my being fired in 2025. That's the
Yep.
state of affairs. And so you find that whenever there is a true telling, holistic and true telling of the history, the experiences, the culture of people of African descent, um, then it becomes, in the minds of many, a threat to the status quo, a threat to the idea of what this country, in terms of the political landscape, in terms of this vision of what the society is supposed to be. It is thought to be in contrast or pushing back against what many people view as what America is about, when actually we're just talking about telling the truth, okay?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so I
Thank
I
you.
I must,
Yes.
I must also pick up in my story, to answer this question. It may be a long way around it, but it's so central to my answer to this question. And as I was finishing up my doctoral program at Emory, I was in the dissertation writing stage. I went to an NCBS conference, a National Council for Black Studies conference, and as fate would have it, at The Ohio State University. So I revisited the place where I got
Amazing.
my master's. I couldn't make this up, right? So in the shuttle from the airport to the campus, I think it was, I was in the airport shuttle. with this gentleman who seemed to be so excited. I told him, "Yeah, I'm going to the Black Studies conference too." He said, "Oh yeah, I'm speaking. I'm going to be speaking." I said, "Oh, okay, wonderful." He said, "Oh, I'm really excited." He said, I'm really excited about what I'm going to be talking about." I said, "Oh, really? Share it with me." He said, "Well, I'm developing a doctoral program in Black Studies." Who was sitting next to me on that shuttle? Who developed the first Black Studies program, okay, and a doctoral Black Studies program in the US? Molefe Asante at
That's
at Temple
amazing.
University, right?
Just sitting
Okay.
on the bus next to you.
Yeah, on the
Yeah.
shuttle, the little shuttle, van. It
Yeah.
was really a van, not a
Van,
bus,
yeah.
okay? And so I'm going, "Yeah, okay." So all these little, affirmations essentially
Mhm.
of the path that I decided to take, and then fast forward, uh, at that conference, okay, I met the man who would become my husband, my first husband, late first husband now, Dr. Norman Harris, okay? And he's a little known, scholar and, institution builder in this history of Black studies, but he was very active in the National Council for Black Studies. I remember going to hear him speak, and I said, "Oh, wow, he's really, really quite something." Someone introduced me to him, and fast forward a few few months later, 6 months later to be exact, we were married, okay? And then married for 25 years. But, he, established, the Institute for African American Studies at the University of Georgia, although they do not credit him with that, for various political
Wow.
reasons, okay? I'm working to change that, to talk with them about, correcting that wrong. We were, at the University of Georgia. That was my first, position as full-time faculty. I was in the School of Journalism, and he was there to establish the Institute for African American Studies. His, appointment was in the English department, but he established the institute, the Interdisciplinary Holistic African American Institute, there. And while we were there, we also created, an entity called the Black Resource Center, and the Black Resource Center essentially was a publishing entity, and we published a journal called Word, a Black Culture Journal. This is the first issue. We were only able to do 2 issues. It was just the 2 of us, really. But we were joined by poetry editor Askia Mohammed Touré. He was our poetry editor, right? Okay, so we produced Word, a Black Culture Journal, while at University of Georgia. Fast forward a few years later, see, that was, we were there from 88, and, we were there until 91, okay? So, 3 years, there, but in that 3-year period, the Institute for African American Studies was born, Word, a Black Culture Journal was born, and actually we got, subscriptions, institutional subscriptions from, libraries all over the country, really even international, libraries. So, just me and my husband and a couple of other people, we were able to produce this, and I think back, "Oh, okay, you were young, a lot of energy." Okay,
That's great.
and then
By the way, just on the name alone, that's a
yes.
journal worth, rehabilitating, so
Yeah, yeah, and so the second issue, of it, we actually produced after we moved to Cincinnati.
mm,
And that was an experience in itself because there, not only, did he develop, the Department of African American Studies, it was there when he came. They hired him to flesh it out, build it, which he did, but we also established an independent, African-centered school, while we were at, University of Cincinnati in the community. And it was all I like to call divine order and divine intelligence, whatever, because, once we decided to do that, and we decided to do it because, we, had two daughters, okay? And our oldest daughter, had learning differences. and the school system in that city, in Cincinnati, was just not addressing her issues. We tried a private community institution school, but it wasn't addressing what she needed. Our youngest daughter, was a preschooler at that time, and so we said, "We're going to start our own school." Okay, and naively, perhaps. But we actually were able to take over the lease from a school. It really was a school that was run by the Catholic Church, and they were closing down. And we got a lease of the building. So it was fully furnished. It had school supplies. It had
Yeah.
the main building, perfect for the first through seventh grade. And there was an adjacent building that was perfect for the preschool that we established for our youngest daughter. We were certified and chartered by the Ohio Department of Education. They came out to do what they do in terms of making sure you're teaching what you're supposed to be teaching. But we were so very proud to say that we had, and we openly shared our curriculum, which was an African-centered curriculum, which means we looked at everything, all the usual topics and subjects, but we entered them through the lens of people of African descent. So we didn't omit anything in terms of that history. But the primary focus was what most institutions of education leave out: the roles, the contributions, and the impact of African Americans, and not just a rah-rah story. We did this, we did that, but the implications of our existence in this country, how it came to be, the dynamics of that, the multi-layers of that, the contradictions, the complexity, all that in our pre-K through seventh grade institution. 1995 was the year of the Million Man March, right? And so our school was in operation at that time, and we had two male teachers at that time, and they decided that we wanted them to. We supported their participating in the Million Man March, and so I think we shut down a little early that day before the march was to be, so they could fly out. Came back to the school and checked not email. That's before prevalent email, but we checked the messages on the phone. I checked the messages on the phone, and there was this one message that said, and it was the sound, the voice was definitely that of a European American woman, and she said, "We are going to kill all your N-word babies." Okay. So immediately we called the police, okay, and they come in with the bomb sniffing dogs. We shut down the school for the day, said, "No, we're not having school."
Jesus.
Our daughters went to the home of one of our parents, and my husband and I stayed on the premises. And so they went through. Fortunately, they didn't find any bombs, okay, but there had been that threat, and that was someone's idea of pushing back against the fact that there had been this Million Man March in Washington, D.C. And so when you look into the phone book, the yellow pages, the African American Academy was one of the first things. And so they decided to reach out and threaten us in that way. But we opened up the very next day, and unasked, unsolicited, that very same day, that next day, we had maybe 3, 4 young men from the Nation of Islam, okay, to come and act as our security without being asked, without payment.
Amazing.
Ours was not, was not a Muslim school, all right? We were African-centered, but it was not associated with any religion. It was culture-based in terms of, but they were there unasked, and they remained for weeks. And in fact, one of the young men actually became one of our teachers.
Amazing. I love that.
Yeah. And I think about it now, and I still tear up because
Yeah.
it was such an act of solidarity for sure, but commitment, dedication. And so The school existed for like 3 years total. 3 years. It came out of a community-based group that we call the Center for African World Studies. And so during this time, we continued to do independent publishing as well, primarily publishing several of my late husband's books. One that's called To Make a Brother Black. That was a novel. And we jointly edited a book called The African American Index. Okay. And the 60s, a Black chronology. These are books that are in libraries across the country and even in other countries in the world. So we feel very proud of that legacy. And then when we left Cincinnati, came to Atlanta, we continued our thrust toward community education by offering online courses through the Department of Education, continuing education courses for a period of time. And when we came to Atlanta, I came and became the chair of the Africana Studies, History, and World Languages Department at Morris Brown College, my alma mater.
Full circle.
Yes, full circle moment, and that was such a wonderful, wonderful experience. Some of the young faculty who started their careers there, have gone on to do wonderful things in other places. One young scholar in particular, Dr. Mario Beatty, was a scholar at Morris Brown College. He's now at Howard University, and he is someone who's a scholar in the Medu Nectar, the language of Kemet, ancient Kemet. So he's definitely not an Egyptologist in the European sense, but his knowledge and study and scholarship on Kemet is definitional, groundbreaking. So he came out of Morris Brown College's faculty in Africana Studies, History, and World Languages, across the way at Morehouse. One of my current colleagues, Dr. Samuel Livingston, he also started his career at Morris Brown.
Okay.
And there are many others who came through, affiliated with during the time I was there, and before my time there. A number of scholars made such an important impact and provided so much support in terms of community efforts. While there, I started something called the Southern Black Communities Oral History Center, in which I did oral history interviews of folk about local Atlanta history, about the history of Morris Brown College, about the history of those involved in movements, the Atlanta student movement. That's when I first started that research. And fast forward decades later, one of my primary initiatives has been the committee to commemorate the Atlanta student movement. So twice a year, since 2019, twice a year, we do events, activities on the campus of Morehouse, but also connected to the community, that activities that are meant to excavate, commemorate, and celebrate the history of students in the Atlanta University Center who established the Atlanta student movement. Those leaders in that movement, and these are students who were with, at the time, Morehouse, Spelman, Morris Brown, Clark College, Atlanta University, they established this movement to push back, protest, demand desegregation, push back against segregation. And their efforts ultimately ended up in the desegregation of public facilities in the city of Atlanta. And many of those leaders who were in the Atlanta student movement went on to become leaders in SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was really headquartered in Atlanta for its first few years. And so that history is, again, not as well known widely as it it should be, and so a goal of that initiative is to, make sure that not only folks in the academy, but folks in the street, in the communities know, what young people have done over time to ensure that, this country lives up, to what it's supposed to be and do in terms of, opportunity, for and freedom for all folk. So, and so I'm leading up to this question you ask, and so again, you can't separate politics from the discipline.
Yeah. Yeah.
You really cannot. And a part of what I am doing now, in addition to the Atlanta student movement work, a few years ago, I was a primary author of, but it was a collective effort with fellow faculty in this institution in Morehouse College. We established an initiative called Movement, Memory, and Justice, looking at the criminal justice system in this country, and how the interactions of African Americans in the criminal justice system, how that has played out, how that's been represented, and the origins. What is the reason that the majority of incarcerated men, incarcerated Americans in U.S. prisons, the percentage Black people, Black men in particular, are disproportionately represented in that population. What's the reason for that? So it's a legacy of enslavement, and all of the laws put in place, the Black codes put in place, that ultimately ensured the South in particular, but not just in the South, it's in the other parts of the country as well, ensured there would be a workforce through the convict leasing system, then the chain gang system, and one might also say that even today, in the mass incarceration system of mass incarceration in the prison industrial complex is the modern manifestation of what was going on after Reconstruction or during Reconstruction and on after, on through the Jim Crow era in terms of using the labor, free labor of incarcerated individuals. Unfortunately, in many cases, the majority of whom were African Americans, using their labor to build infrastructure for governments, local, state governments, and for private industry, private businesses.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I teach a class regularly on race and mass incarceration at University of Maryland, and I point out to the students, and it's one of these like quick comments. I mean, we end up talking about it for a long time, that they changes them instantly, which is that in the University of Maryland system, so that's the entire system, not just the College Park campus, every single piece of furniture at the university is made by prison labor, and getting them to look down at their desk and realize that what we're about to study, they have a pretty good idea where we're going with it. And the way they keep circling back to that, because as you said, it's infrastructure.
Yes.
Right. I mean, there's the big story of public institutions and like whether it's like railways or buildings or, and then there's also that the way that folds right into them sitting on a desk.
Yes, this is not ancient history.
Leaning up against it, and it's like this stuff is brand new.
Yeah.
And how does it feel to inherit this history where we sit? And it's interesting. They go through a phase. A lot of them, I can't generalize, but a lot of them go through a phase of being a little bit angry that I mentioned it. Right. But then at the end, they're like, "I'm glad you mentioned that because it meant that I couldn't get away from this class." And I was like, well, that's the thing about Black Studies is you can't really ever get away from it because it's not a side quest.
Exactly,
it's the main story. And I love just hearing you talk, about all of these things related to the, you started with that comment that I think is so important, which is just to talk about the lives of Black people is already a massive political statement that could get you fired. It's kind of an odd question to separate politics and intellectual inquiry in 2025. But also, I really appreciated you talking so much about institution building, whether it's the two-issue journal, whether it's the school, whether it's building an Institute for African American Studies or Africana Studies. And I appreciate that just because I think those are important stories to tell. But I worry sometimes, and in this podcast with you as a guest, but I just am hearing this and I'm responding. I do think that a lot of younger scholars, and now I'm not associating myself with that. As a 57-year-old, I used to think of myself as a younger scholar. But, well, yeah, you haven't seen me wake up in the morning. but I think so much of like what it means to build an institution in something like Black Studies, whether, with a department is one thing, but all these other things that you've been talking about, I think we've arrived at a point as part of the institutionalization of the field where to make these kinds of innovations, people have begun to imagine that requires like a million or multi-million-dollar grant. Mm-hmm. But so much of what you're talking about, when you're like, my husband and I decided to do this, and then we had our, this, poet and this found this publishing house, and this was an important story to tell, and we were able to get this in libraries. That level of making institutions with whatever resources are available, I just think in 2025, well, this will come out in 2026, so in the mid-2020s, I think it's just a really important reminder that these institutions have to be built. They don't have to be, the Hutchins Center at Harvard. They can be a couple of years of an issue of a journal. They can be a community school. They can be a wing of a community school that already exists, and that these things coming through effort and investment of time and energy and personhood.
And support from the community. That's so very important. But let me be clear, I don't think it's not wrong to get support from various foundations, okay?
Totally
this
agree.
Movement, Memory, and Justice Initiative, we had the support, the Mellon Foundation, $1.4 million grant over like a 3-year period for that initiative. So if these resources are out there and coming from the right the right source in terms of the goals of that entity. Yeah. What are the goals? What's the mission? Then certainly, too often we miss out on opportunities because of fear of being turned down, rejected. I went to all that trouble to fill out that application and turn all this in, and they didn't give me the grant. You have to keep at it,
I need that reminder. Thank you. I quit easily.
You have to keep at it, and then launching initiatives, building institutions on your own. It doesn't come without penalties. We declared for bankruptcy after the academy, after the school. We put all of our personal resources. It was that important, not just for our children, our daughters, but the community, the children in the community, the parents in the community. We had a parent group. The parents would come in the evenings and on weekends, and we'd do workshops with them. And so it was worth, that's, long gone now. That bankruptcy, what is it, a 7-year period? And so that was done, but it was worth it. It was definitely worth that investment. But let me finish quickly. I know we've been talking about an hour already, but in terms of my trajectory, after I left Morris Brown College, I was hired by UNCF, the United Negro College Fund. I was one of the founding directors of an entity called the Institute for Capacity Building. UNCF has member institutions about, 35, I'm not sure the exact number now, but when I was there were 39 member institutions. These were private, historically Black colleges and universities. The Institute for Capacity Building was the brainchild of Dr. Michael Lomax, who's the president of UNCF, CEO of UNCF, and he had this brainchild about creating an entity that would be focused on helping HBCUs, especially private historically Black colleges and universities, to build their capacity to do this important work. And so the areas of focus were, my area was specifically curriculum and faculty enhancement. I was the founding director of that program. There was a program on enrollment management, advancement. What are the things that our institutions need to do to ramp up their fundraising and ability to get partnerships with whether corporations or foundations. There was an executive leadership and governance program within the Institute for Capacity Building, and that entity still exists, by the way. And in 2026, we'll be celebrating its 20th anniversary, and I'm just so excited to be working with UNCF to commemorate the beginning of the Institute for Capacity Building, which continues to do this important work that, again, is more important now than ever before because of the many, many obstacles and threats that are being put in the path of our institutions. So I was there for about 6 years, and then I was invited to apply for deanship at Morehouse College. And so this was 2012. And so I did, and I became the first woman academic dean at Morehouse College, and I was Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences, and in that work, and also Professor of Africana Studies there. And so just a wonderful, wonderful tenure there, dealing with faculty whose objectives are always about whatever the field, whatever the discipline they were teaching, and within my division, certainly, but also by extension, the other divisions, it was always understanding that the history and culture experiences of Black people have to be acknowledged, have to be understood, have to be studied in some way, shape, or form to help train individuals, in this case, men of Morehouse who became Morehouse men, who would live up to the mission of the college, the mission tied to service to the community, tied to really a dedication to social justice. You know, one of the most famous graduates everyone knows, Martin Luther King Jr., one of the most famous graduates of Morehouse College. And so, but not only him, there were others who went on to do important work in terms of telling the stories of African Americans, fighting for the rights of African Americans, just social justice more broadly, human rights. And so living up to that mission, and there was a phrase, there was a sentence in the mission statement that the college takes a special responsibility of teaching the history and culture of Black people for these purposes, not just for the knowledge's sake, even though that's empowering to have that knowledge. It does much for one's sense of self-identity. But to use that knowledge, to learn the lessons, to anticipate. We could have anticipated, and many of us did, I guess, current events, okay, based on history. None of this is new, really. It's being manifested in interesting ways this time around.
Interesting, yes.
But there are precedents for what is happening now, and we can learn lessons that will help us negotiate what is happening now and negotiate things in ways that will ensure that we as a people, as a community, as all people who are about social justice, human rights, look at this history and understand ways that we can overcome it, ultimately overcome those things that are working against the essentially the valuing of human life and human experiences. And so we have to understand we can't shy away from and say that what we do has no political dimension. You know,
Yeah, absolutely.
we have to understand it, and not necessarily say that we are a particular political party, because it quite frankly, they're kind of all fuzzy in my head now in terms of who's doing what, and in
Yeah,
terms of which part.
unfortunately.
You have to look at what's right, what's just. What can you do to ensure that people have the rights, the privileges, the opportunities that every human being on the planet should have? And so our goal, our mission in the field of Black studies It hasn't changed really, but it has become even more stressed, italicized, and exclamation points behind
Yeah.
every mission statement as we continue this work. Yeah, so we just have to reaffirm and move forward with all the dedication that we have had over time. That must continue and push back against efforts to eliminate, erase the work that we do.
I love that. Thank you. Yeah. And I mean, in some ways, then I think you stepped right into the one of the first of these last two questions I had for you. Um, in thinking about both the past and the future of Black studies in this way, what do you think that the field of Black studies has done well, and what do you think it has not done particularly well?
That's a very good question. Well, I think what it has done well, quite frankly, is to um, in terms of academia, in terms of higher education, it has shown the importance of the necessity of using an interdisciplinary approach to the study of just about within any particular discipline. Nothing should be isolated and cut off. I'm a historian, okay? I teach literature. I teach science, and all the other things that, I don't focus on. No, the Black studies, the development of the discipline of Black studies, African American studies, Africana studies, African world diaspora studies, whatever you choose to call it, has been about the understanding, helping scholars, helping the academy to understand the importance of a holistic approach to the study of any particular area. You can't just stop there. You have to, if you're going to tell a complete story, okay, if you're going to really understand whatever the discipline you're in, whether it's science, the sciences, hard sciences, it's social sciences, you have to have that approach. And of course, Black studies burst in many ways, shape, and form women's studies. And it birthed the focus on Latino studies. And so all of these other fields that are so important to higher education, again, if you're going to really, really do education right, you have to have these areas of focus. And so Black studies essentially opened the gate, opened the door for these
Absolutely.
other disciplines, these other areas of focus.
So let me then ask as a final question, and I love that. Thank you so much for just putting that the productiveness of Black studies, not just for the study of
Mhm,
Black life, but
mhm.
for thinking about education more broadly, and as a word you've used a few times, holistically.
Yeah,
I
and
just think
you
that
asked
that's so
this a
important.
second there was a second part to your question that I
Oh yeah,
don't think
did you
I
want to
did.
say what you think it has not done particularly well?
Right.
I thought maybe you were avoided. Sometimes people want to avoid that. I was going to let you, but
No,
yeah.
no, not really. Don't want to avoid it. I think inevitably, and I'll go way back and pull up one of those phrases, concepts that Du Bois talked about so many years ago, in that concept of double consciousness.
Mhm.
It still exists, we may call it something else, but the way it manifests in our field is that despite the dedication to understanding and really delving into the history and culture of Black people and African-centered perspective, there is still the belief that you have to also be wedded to a very narrow Eurocentric model in terms of what counts as scholarship,
Mhm.
what counts as real true academic work. And so you have these tensions that unfortunately still exist. In Black studies, the understanding is that you are not either or, not either an academic or someone that just does some work in the community, community organizer, whatever, but that your work as an academic has to be in service to the community. Okay.
Mhm.
And if that's the case, then whatever you do in the community, whether it's an exhibition that you do at a museum, and I have to shout out the Apex Museum here in Atlanta. I'm on the board for the Apex Museum, an African American History Museum, established 50 years ago almost to uplift the history and culture of Black people. The first Black History Museum in the city of Atlanta. So whether you're doing an exhibition in a museum, okay, or you're creating, let's say, digital humanities tools that will be used by public school kids or kids in K-12, or you are part of an organization that is focused on helping individuals in the community with their challenges in obtaining housing, the unhoused. So whatever you're doing, if it's connected, you're on the faculty and you're doing these work in the community, um, there has to be a connection. So many people are fearful of not getting tenure and promotion to the extent that, is still a thing, and it is, we're holding on to it. But because they are doing so much community work, they haven't had as much time to do their scholarly research, quote unquote scholarly research. I don't think you can do, from my perspective, scholarly research without it being at the Black scholar in Black
Yeah.
studies, without it being informed by the work you do in the community in whatever form that takes. And so it's about rededicating ourselves to the original mission of Black studies. And there, I think, sometimes can be some drift. You mentioned the young scholars nowadays, and the focus of many, understandably, they want to get tenure promotion. So they want to do publish in peer-reviewed journals, published in the academic presses. But sure, you do that, and that's good. It's important to do, but also think about doing things in a way that will make what you do, the work, the important work that you do, the research that you uncover, to make that information accessible to people in the community, to children, to the youth, to the older generations. They need that information. They need to know, because it has been taken out of our schools across the country.
Yeah, thank you for that. And it's one of those things there's lots of things in this conversation that this episode would be really fantastic, and people are going to learn and have a lot to think about. But I think that this last bit that you said is so important, because a lot of people will be like me, hearing it as they are a part of leadership organization or leadership structures inside of whether it's, schools or in departments, right? So they're dean's offices or departmental leadership, where you're actually in a position to have an impact on this kind of thing about what counts as scholarship and how we think about tenure earning dossiers. And, we need to be thinking expansively about that in a Black studies context. As you said, as you reminded us, not just from your or my value system, but the very origins and meaning of the field.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
So maybe this is already then a bit of an answer to the last question I had for you, which is, thinking about Black studies as a field, what is the question you would want us to all be asking, or the issue you would want us to all be thinking about?
The issue we should all be thinking about, the question that we should all be answering. I think the issue, the question, the concept, the topic has been out there over time, and now is the time to bring it back into our thinking. It can't be something that's understood or a given, but we have to evoke the spirit of the concept of Pan-Africanism, okay? And so I just learned recently that term, that concept, that the idea of Pan-Africanism, for a long time, for some, is out of favor, and it's by some, it's almost dismissed. Oh, that's never going to happen. No, it is the only route that makes sense for people of African descent, but not only for people of African descent. If you understand the original focus, the original purpose of the whole notion of Pan-Africanism, I'm thinking back to the early days, the origins in the late 19th century, and then on to Du Bois and his interest and focus on Pan-Africanism. You can talk about Marcus Garvey and the focus on Pan-Africanism. And if there was an understanding that unless people of African descent around the world really unite on multiple levels, on many levels as possible, um, then we are not in for a future that will be inclusive of us. And we see it already happening. There was the first scramble for Africa occurred in, what was it, 1884, 1885, the meeting, the Berlin Conference, and you had all the European powers around the table and the U.S. sitting on the sidelines. They divided up the continent in ways that were antithetical to the beliefs, the cultures, the existences of the people on the continent of Africa. And so a reason for all the dissension and conflict and turmoil that exist on the continent today can be traced back to these to the division of the slicing of the African pie. All right. Now, for sure, those who invaded and took over the colonizers used existing tensions that may have been around in different different parts of the continent. They exacerbated those, and then they put in place individuals who would do their bidding. And so fast forward, what you have, even though there was that brief period of time that we were elated, excited by the independence movements and the achievement of independence by African countries, the 50s and 60s. Of course, what we found is that it was not true independence for most, if not all. And the neocolonialism, just reared its ugly head. And so you still had the Europeans that were in control of these countries, of African people. And you had European countries extracting the resources that existed. Africa is the richest continent on the planet, and yet, the image of Africa is as the most impoverished and the most deficit in terms of every aspect of life. That's the image that's put out there. But the reality is, it's the richest continent, and the countries on Africa, the richest places on the planet, what's underneath the feet that's been extracted, the gold, the minerals, and other resources that have been taken out, and those on the continent, the individuals, the countries, have not reaped the benefits of the wealth of their own countries, the wealth of their own homelands. And so we're in another pivotal moment in which there is this attempt, and it's happening. Another version of colonialism is taking shape. And so the answer to that is to revive the Pan-African spirit that was established, early on with Henry Sylvester Williams and Alexander Crummell, and even before that, Martin Delany, and then Du Bois and Garvey, and then on into the 20th century with Malcolm X. And one of the major reasons that Malcolm X is no longer with us on the planet was because of his really advocacy of Pan-Africanism. And beyond that, not only Pan-Africanism, but the uniting of people of African descent across the globe, on the continent, in the diaspora, the U.S., in the Caribbean, in Europe, but by extension, an internationalism that would unite people of African descent with all oppressed people around the globe, whether white, Black, Asian, whatever, Native American. And can you imagine how powerful that would be? A
Yeah.
true uniting of all oppressed people around the world. And so that is a fear that is out there and a reason for current events. The fear that that is something that would occur. And that is something that we, in the discipline of Black studies, must focus on if we are to be true, to our original mission.
I love that. Thank you. That's such a wonderful place to end on, because it's a reminder, and you've had a few of these moments of the origins of the field, right? Both intellectually, but also the establishment of the field and the academy bears lessons and imperatives that are fresh and new in 2026. As you said, Pan-Africanism may go back all this way, to the origins of, African-American thought and Caribbean thought, with Garvey and Du Bois and Delaney and so forth. But those are lessons for today. And
Yes.
I like the way you've come back to the origin has a lesson for our contemporary. And this has just been such a fantastic conversation, Clarissa. I really appreciate your time and thoughtfulness in this. This is an amazing contribution to the series.
Well,
I really,
thank
really
you, John. Again, thank you for the invitation. It's really been a pleasure to talk with you. And I must just shout out the Black Scholar Journal.
Yes, please.
I am co-editor-in-chief with Dr. Michael Samanga, and our issue, when this podcast is streamed, our issue on Malcolm X. It's a
Fantastic.
double issue. The first part of the issue is on immortal Malcolm, the lasting legacy of Malcolm X, and again, in the last year and a half to 2 years of his life, his emphasis was on the importance of reviving the Pan-African spirit and connecting on an international basis to all the oppressed people around the planet. The Black Scholar, I think, is an important part of this move to help people understand the academia must stay connected to the community. It's always the mission. It was always to be a publication that was both valued in academia and in the community. Back in the day, you'd see the Black Scholar in the barbershop, in the beauty shop, as well as in the libraries and on the desks of academics. So we're trying to return to
I love that.
to that. And then I'll give another shout out to the African Diaspora Development Institute, and that entity, which was established by Dr. Africana Kwao, who is the former ambassador to the UN from the African Union. She served in that capacity for 3 years. The organization she has since established is about reviving the spirit of Pan-Africanism and connecting people of African descent to our brothers and sisters on the continent. And we've just returned from a trip just in recent months from Burkina Faso. And so that is a site of attempts to really reinvigorate the African spirit while actually assisting that country, and not going in as missionaries, but going in to ask, how can we help? How can we be of service
Perfect.
as you attempt to build your infrastructure and really ensure that your country and its people have everything they need to live a high quality of life?
Thank you. Both those shout outs, super important, and really great thing for people to think about. How can they make these kinds of contributions? They're absolutely so essential for so many reasons. And so before we wrap up, I just wanted to ask, is there anything else you want to mention?
Yes, John, I want to give a final shout out to my husband, Dr. Raymond White. I mentioned the work that I have done, or that I did over the years with my first husband, Dr. Norman Harris, who passed in 2012. I was blessed just within the last few years to meet another soulmate in Dr. Raymond R. White Sr., who actually is a city planner. He was a city planner, the director of city planning for DeKalb County here in Georgia for a number of years. He is the one who introduced me to the African Diaspora Development Institute. He's been a longtime member. And so he and I traveled to Burkina Faso last year. And moving forward, we'll be doing several initiatives in collaboration with that organization.
Fantastic. No, I'm glad to get the name and that org, and I'm so glad that work is ongoing. It just sounds just incredibly important. So.
Yes, indeed.
Well, again, it just has been so fantastic to have you as part of this podcast. It's going to be a really important contribution to the series, and I just really appreciate your time and thoughtfulness.
Thank you, John. I appreciate the invitation.
All right. Well, take care. Have a great rest of your day.
You too. Take care. Bye-bye.